Okay, dear audience, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this online event here at the Foreign Policy Society. My name is Charlotte Flindt Pedersen. I'm the director of the Danish Foreign Policy Society, and I'm the host of today's meeting. We are so very happy today to invite the US Ambassador, Carla Sands, to talk about US foreign policy and the changes taking place under the slogan of America First. What does that imply? What are then the role of America's allies, just like Denmark, and under this doctrine? So Ambassador Sands will first make a short presentation. Then there'll be a Q&A with Philip Christian Ulrich, Foreign Policy Editor at Kongressen.com. And then there will be questions and answers from the attendees. So I look very much forward to the next hour in this conversation with the US Ambassador, Carla Sands. And so my next words is welcome, Mrs. Sands, and welcome to make your presentation here today.
Thank you and good evening. I want to thank, first of all, our hosts at the Foreign Policy Society, and especially the director, Charlotte Flindt Pedersen. And thanks also to Philip Ulrich for moderating today's event. And I'm here to talk about the great alliance between the US and the Kingdom of Denmark and our shared democratic values. So some of our shared democratic values, and what does that mean? I think our democratic values set us apart from authoritarian regimes. And if you might think of the things we hold dear, like our freedom of speech, our ability to choose our elected leaders, our freedom of the press, protecting human rights, our rule of law, you could say that liberty is in our DNA. And it's important, I think, that the United States and Europe, that we stand up loudly in defense and promoting our shared values, because clearly they're under attack. And the United States, like every country, we're not perfect, right? We acknowledge our history, and I think that's part of what sets us apart from malign regimes or actors, like the PRC. For instance, when I first got to Denmark, I was at a dinner party at Moulins Palais, and it's a gorgeous room with all this gorgeous plasterwork, and I saw a Nazi swastika on the wall. And I was shocked, and I turned to my dinner companion and I said, I see a swastika, how could this be? And they said, yes, we were occupied by the Nazis, and we leave the swastika because it reminds us of our history and what we were and what we are today. And it makes me think of how important it is that we remind ourselves and teach the children and our young people about our history, often so we don't repeat it. For instance, in American parks, especially in the Southeast these days, we see leftist groups and sometimes politicians pulling down statues, Confederate general statues that commemorate the Civil War. Well, you might say, you know, why would they do that? Well, they don't want to look at a reminder of the Civil War and the oppression of one of our populations in the United States. When, if we were following the Danish model, and I actually think it's important, it's a teachable moment for our children. What's the statue? It's a Confederate general or soldier, and we are now a society that says we have equal rights for all. And the struggle of our Civil War and President Lincoln, what came out of that was a better version of ourselves. And so I think it's really important that we do acknowledge our history and move on. I will just say to the point of the Danish freedom of speech that the United States shares, I think Denmark has been a real leader in this area. If you look at what happened with the publishing of the Muhammad cartoons and how the Danes are so, they're so supportive of their freedom of speech that they were willing to publish those cartoons. I don't think most American newspapers were willing to actually publish those. And so when you think about how do we exercise our right of freedom of speech, by actively by actively using it and not self-censoring or suppressing. And we can see that happening in governments around the world right now regarding the PRC, People's Republic of China, and their malign activities. You can see it in American companies. I just read just this week, there was someone fired from an American company because they had a shirt that referred to the coronavirus and Wuhan. I think it was wet markets or something, and the company fired the person, but where's the freedom of speech? So I think it's very, very important that we are actively using our freedom of speech. And freedom of speech, I'd like to remind Americans that criticize some people for saying certain things. It's not there for the speech we like. It's sometimes there for the speech that we don't like. And that protects other people's views. And so there is a great, I think, movement underway in even the Western world to begin to suppress and freedom of speech and self-censor. And I think it's something that we not only have to watch out for, but we have to be sure that we push back against. And then I like to think about one of my top line things in my mind as I go about my days lately is how did we get here? Here we are. I'm not addressing you in person. I'm addressing you on a computer monitor. And how did we find ourselves in this situation? And it is because you can say the Chinese Communist Party's lack of transparency, their censorship, the suppression of information during the beginning, certainly, and continued really, coronavirus pandemic. And the censorship, it's because China doesn't have a press. They have propaganda. There's nothing that's put out on any of their channels that doesn't flow from the party to support the party and keep the party secure. And if you think about what happened because of the suppression of information, the lack of transparency, the lack of freedom of speech, well, we know that we had some doctors in Wuhan that noticed there was a problem, and their views were suppressed because they were arrested and forced to write apologies for spreading gossip, I think, or rumors. And so, and it just went from there with not sharing it with first the Chinese people and then with the rest of the world. And the WHO is, the World Health Organization, is an important organization we're members of, along with the People's Republic of China. And it has two functions. One is to alert, and another is to help to, in an emergency, come in and help in something like a pandemic or a health crisis in the world. And so what happened? Well, back in 2002-03, there was the SARS epidemic that came out also of a wet market in China. And because of the failures of the World Health Organization at that time, the countries came together and reformed the WHO so that in 2007, new rules went into place. And the rules said things like every country that has some kind of a health issue pop up has to alert the WHO within 24 hours. This did not happen. And then secondly, if there's something like a pandemic or something that could be catching throughout the world, there's another bar that they must alert the WHO immediately. And none of this happened. And if you flash forward now, you can see that not only did the party, the Chinese Communist Party, not alert the WHO, it actually suppressed the information from flowing. And when they realized that they had a problem, they closed the flights from Wuhan to the rest of China, but they allowed the flights from Wuhan to the rest of the world. So we consider that, if you look at that critically as a thing, it's hard to imagine that a country would allow that a country would stop the travel internally, but allow the spread of this to go out to the rest of the world. And I've heard our Secretary of State and President say that there will be a reckoning. So we have concerns about the PRC's influence on international organizations, specifically the WHO. And then you look at the support of the WHO, and you can see that China gives about 19 million in 2019. The United States gave about 50 million in 2019. And those are 18 figures. And then you can look at how the United States government has already supported this pandemic worldwide in gear and in medical assistance and other kinds of assistance to places in the world that have been affected. They've already committed $700 million. And American citizens and faith-based groups and civil societies have already contributed $3 billion. I mean, it's extraordinary. I'm so proud that America is a generous and kind country. Then we do things because we're good people, not to gain points or win any kind of a PR war. It's because we are who we are. In fact, I think that over the past 20 years, the United States as a whole, including government and people and NGOs, have given about $140 billion to the world for health efforts and to stop things like pandemics and disease. So when we look also, we also should look critically at the World Trade Organization and the UN and the abuses by the Chinese Communist Party, because they're not following the rules of the road. Denmark, the United States, the other members of these organizations are generally following the rules. And if we have one large player that doesn't follow the rules, I think there has to be an accounting, like how can you have one member not follow the rules that everyone else follows? It doesn't work, it's not sustainable. And when I think about the properly functioning public health system, we should all want that from the WHO, and the Europeans should support that and insist on that. That's why the WHO was sort of reorganized with new rules in 2007 after the SARS outbreak. And of course, we don't all agree every day, Denmark, US, because we're like good friends or family members. There's little things that are different, but our fundamentals, our democracy, our fundamental beliefs, they're very similar. And that is another big difference between countries like Denmark and the United States and authoritarian regimes, whichever one they are. And in the Kingdom of Denmark, my team at the embassy and we work on largely three areas, three broad categories. One is increasing Danish trade and investment in the United States and promoting prosperity. The second is strengthening our bilateral security relationship. And the third, it's building bridges between Americans and the Kingdom of Denmark. And I like to think that the Danes and the Americans, that we're friends and we care about each other's future. And I think that there's no better way to look at this than to look at our economic and defense relationship. For instance, Danish goods. Americans love buying Danish products. I know when I was living in California, I would get these catalogs called Aarhus, and they had these beautiful Danish furnishings and these throws. It was all very hygge, and it's very popular in the United States. And I also think about my daughter. When she wanted a speaker, the one she wanted was a soundbox because it's Danish built, it's basically indestructible and fantastic. So there's a lot of other Danish products we love, but we Americans do love Danish goods, and you can tell by how much we buy. But I think getting back to our economy and our trade, you know, we've never seen anything in our lifetimes like this pandemic. And the trade, it's going to be a challenge, I think, in the next, certainly the near term, as our companies and our consumers regain their confidence in the economy and their confidence to spend. But I know that we will recover. It's just, I don't know the timeline, and I don't know that anyone does. Maybe economists have a better idea. But the US, we're looking around the world, and we're building trade relationships with free trade. And we like to think that our brand is a trustworthy brand, that we build trust relationships between our trading partners and ourselves. We want trade that has reciprocity. We want trade that where the parties treat each other fairly. And we also want the US and the Kingdom of Denmark for each other to be secure and successful. I like to think that we trust each other and we care about each other's futures. And that's how our trade relationship is built. And we've been renewing trade agreements. We are working to secure fair and reciprocal trade deals with the EU. We've been in talks about this. We have a new USMCA trade deal between Canada and Mexico. We have the phase 1 completed with the PRC. And then we've done FTAs with Japan and South Korea. So President Trump and his administration are looking at trade as a very, very important part of our prosperity and, of course, our security. And they are, I would say, making trade deals relevant for today and making them functional for all the parties. So it's not just a nod at it, but it's actually a roadmap, the deals that his administration is doing. And we like the idea of treating each other the way we're treated. We like to treat others the way we're treated. The reciprocity is very important to the United States. And I know it is to Danes too. So the US last year surpassed Germany as Denmark's biggest export market, and we're proud to be that. And we expect in return that Denmark works to be open to American businesses in a reciprocal fashion. And we don't block Danish goods, and we would like more access to the Danish market. Like I said, we treat others the way we want to be treated. And we know all about the Communist Party's abuses to the WTO since it became a member. They've blackmailed businesses and individuals. They've prevented fair trade. They've stolen IP. And they've put up barriers to their markets to foreign countries. We hope domestically to build momentum in our trade relationship with Greenland and the Faroe Islands, because we know that prosperity makes countries less vulnerable to intimidation and malign influence. And our whole of government engagement with Greenland includes over $12 million to support economic growth, energy and natural resource development, and education programs. We're working with the State Department and other departments in Washington, like the Bureau of Energy and Natural Resources, the education programs, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Commerce Special American Business Internship Training, and USAID. And we need, we think, to stand up for our shared values and to loudly broadcast their importance around the world. And by doing this, we know we can keep democracy strong and allow peace and prosperity to continue to flourish. In our embassy outreach, we highlight how democratic values underpin Western institutions and how critical they are to our transatlantic alliance. We also work every day to strengthen our bilateral security relationship. We have had a military alliance since World War II, and we like to think it's the backbone of our cooperation. And we're committed, the United States, to a low tension region in the Arctic. The Russian and the People's Republic of China malign actions and military aggression mean that we both have to do more in the Arctic. And I like to think that we stand in unbreakable solidarity with NATO. We believe it to keep the alliance strong in the face of new threats, including cyber and artificial intelligence and even energy security. Our cooperation is very, very important. And the other pillar that we work on is building bridges between Danes and the United States. And lately, through media engagement and digital content and virtual programs, we have highlighted our country's shared values. And we keep our public affairs team really busy, especially these days. Our normal bridge building involves travel for cultural, educational, and professional exchanges that showcase American values and expertise throughout the Kingdom of Denmark. And I'm looking forward to getting back to that, but for the time being, our work is largely virtual. So again, a hat tip to our public affairs section. And the US as an Arctic nation is proud to use the expertise and shared heritage of US states like Alaska and Maine to strengthen economic and cultural connections between Greenland and the Faroe Islands. They even have puffins in Maine, which I never knew before. I actually went to the Faroe Islands to see puffins with my daughter. But unlike authoritarian nations, Denmark and the US, we have spirited exchanges, and we share ideas and differences openly and transparently. It's messy, but it's what makes democracy great. Unlike countries where there's one leader or one party that controls the press and the message. So at the US Embassy, every day, we work to promote democratic values, to increase trade between the United States and the Kingdom of Denmark, and to sustain our great shared security relationship, including reminding Denmark of its commitments to NATO. And we're also working to bring awareness of authoritarian regimes' power and influence in the region, and how democratic countries must partner together to reflect how the PRC, the People's Republic of China, abuses the rights of their own citizens, suppresses information, and has now caused a global pandemic and the resulting global recession. And we have to reconsider, how do we involve them in international organizations? And what does our trade and our reliance on the Communist Party look like? We have a responsibility to safeguard the democratic values and the way of life that we care about and hold dear. And I look forward to your questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. I will now pass on the words to the questions, the possibility for questions to Philip Christian Ulrich. So please, Philip.
Well, thank you, Madam Ambassador, for taking the time this afternoon to talk to us. I would like to begin the talk by talking about the headline that President Trump has given US foreign policy, the concept of America First. Because let's be honest, since January 2017, I think a lot of people have wondered what's behind this idea of America First. And I know I spend a lot of time getting that question, both when I'm out talking at high schools or in Danish media, because you talk a lot about the actions of the PRC in international organizations and the human rights violations and all that. But I think a lot of Danes still actually don't understand the change that the Trump administration has brought to US foreign policy with the concept of America First. So could you perhaps very briefly tell us, how should we understand this America First doctrine?
I could try. The America First idea is, and the president has said this, it's America first, but not America alone. And I think that his concept and his administration's concept is that just like your prime minister should think first of the Danes and their needs, and then you do good works around the world. But first you have to make sure your country is secure, your borders are whatever you decide they are, and your trade, your security, all of those things are taken care of And then we do our outreach and our whatever we're doing with other partners. In the United States, there were many really bad trade deals that were created. I've been reading them in the newspapers for decades. We would do these trade deals with the PRC, and there was one scenario, and that was they win, we lose. It was so appalling. And even when I looked at NAFTA, and I read it as a young adult, and this was the trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, and I saw how it would affect American employees of companies and how negative it would be for American companies. And as a matter of fact, a lot of companies closed after that was signed because it was easier to go to Mexico than to manufacture in the United States. And I think one of the consequences of this pandemic that we're experiencing is that probably some things will be onshored. I don't think we'll ever again feel safe to have our pharmaceuticals manufactured in a country that threatens not to send them if they're not happy with us, or other things that we rely on for our functioning as a country. So it's America first and not America alone. And I hope that every head of state in the world thinks that same way, that they put their citizens first, and then they do outreach to support with good works and all the other efforts that we do worldwide.
But for the past 75 years, the idea of American foreign policy has been that in order to secure the United States national security, trade, active leadership has been necessary, active engaging in free trade deals. With the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, there was bipartisan agreement that, yes, it might not be the most ideal trade agreement, but the strategic price was worth it, because there was an advantage towards the PRC. So how does the Trump administration think that you can secure U.S. interests with this very, shall we say, tough stance towards international organizations? Like you just cut the financing of the WHO. I mean, how do you want to reform the organizations if you antagonize them, or at least make a lot of allies very anxious?
Right. Well, if I'll just take you back to, we reformed it in 2007 so that this wouldn't happen again. And guess what? We're not getting our money's worth, and neither is Denmark, because look at what we're facing now with the recession in our countries, the lost jobs and lost lives. None of this had to happen. If it had worked the way it's supposed to, with the transparency that's promised, with the live samples that are, according to the rules, they have to be shared. But the PRC is not sharing those live samples, and they refuse to allow our experts to go in and even look at how did this happen. The United States has great capabilities in this area, but the Communist Party is stopping us. So that's not supposed to be under the reforms of the WHO. And regarding the international trade deals and things like this, I think actually America's leading today more than it did in the past. We want international trade deals, but they have to work for all the parties. It has to be win-win, not we lose, you win. It has to be good for everybody. And there are areas where we want to cooperate with Europe, but we also want free and reciprocal trade. There are a lot of American products that have higher safety standards than European products, and yet the EU out of Brussels keeps our products out. That's not fair. We don't block European products in that way. We want reciprocity, and this president is going to insist on it.
But speaking of the president, because I get that the idea of reforming and also reciprocity in trade deals and all these other things, but a key reason for some confusion about U.S. foreign policy under President Trump is that at times it seems like there are 2, 3, maybe even 4 tracks or messages coming out of the administration, or at least there has been in the first couple of years. Like if you take the war on ISIS, President Trump declares mission accomplished and that the United States should withdraw from Syria. That order was given 3 times and sort of countermanded in the Pentagon, or at least followed up by some sort of message from the Pentagon that, well, we're not actually really going to do that. And we've also had instances with regards to Russia, with the PRC, with the Middle East. But my question is, how should we as American allies in Denmark and in Europe generally how should we approach U.S. foreign policy with these different tracks? I mean, which one should we listen to?
I appreciate your question. And I think when it comes to ISIS, let's just go back to when President Trump was elected. ISIS held a very large area of land, in Syria and Iraq. I mean, they were really growing and becoming a nation state. They were printing their own money, and they were adding land and power and wealth every day. And they had a lot of very negative projects that they were working on to fund this thing. And within a very short time after his election, he was able to defeat ISIS. It is true, they are not a caliphate. But you're right, they're still out there. And certainly the president has listened to the generals. He does not want to be in these expeditionary wars. He is not part of that old military industrial complex that so many American presidents seemed to be part of, where they would start wars around the world or take out leadership without anticipating what would happen in a vacuum. And so I really appreciate how he has led in this way with strong resolve. And as far as this tension goes between military and the administration, I think they listen to each other and they come to a resolve together. I think it's democracy, messy. DOD has their ideas and the president has his, and they do figure it out at the end. But I understand that it's not typical where we have a very predictable path. Instead, you have a person that was never a politician before, and I think he's doing an outstanding job leading, and really no one can really prepare for the presidency, right? But he has great skills in how he has negotiated and how he has defended America's interests.
But these discussions have always happened between the Pentagon and the president. I mean, there have always been issues. The president wants one road and the military says another. But those discussions have always happened behind closed doors. I mean, we have now a president who's doing a lot of his foreign policy announcements on Twitter, surprising the military, and then taking the discussion with the military. Isn't that, I mean, that must also, for your diplomatic staff at the embassy, be a challenge. I mean, how are we supposed to handle that as allies? Because we can't change as fast, perhaps, as President Trump can tweet.
I hear what you're saying, and it is a new way of operating, but I think it also can help us against adversaries who are used to a very predictable path, and they can use their own means to gain advantage. And so I think it's an interesting approach, and I think largely it has been very successful.
Well, wouldn't it be a better point if the bureaucracies were involved in taking the discussion before the announcement? Because I appreciate the element of surprise in international relations can be a benefit, but isn't it better if your own system isn't as surprised?
I think that has happened a few times, but you know, at the end of the day, we've gotten to a good place.
Okay. Well, also, if we look at the counter ISIS campaign, because pretty much the president has pretty much announced, well, mission accomplished. He has basically said we can go home now. The troops are coming home. But the war against ISIS was coming very, very much along, even when President Trump took office.
What?
Absolutely, there was a great offensive. There was a big offensive being initiated against Mosul in the months leading up to the inauguration. ISIS was being pounded in Syria. Special forces were on the ground in Syria, so the war was moving along. So I appreciate that President Trump has removed some of the obstacles for the use of force in the war, but it's just not true that the war was not going anywhere, and that ISIS was expanding at the time. They were being pressured. But where do we go from here with the great uncertainty that a lot of American allies have towards the president? Now, if he's reelected in November, what's the way that we should approach this new foreign policy? Because it seems like now he has a team around him that supports his America First agenda, which I think we can agree he hasn't had the whole time while he's been in the White House. So how do we handle it from here?
Oh, I think working with the president to get European trade, a European trade deal would be a great start, because certainly we need to get that right. But I think the biggest issue is Europe and the US as the two great Western, you could say, powers, EU and the US. If we can work together to support democracy and push forward in the world loudly and proudly our freedoms, and push back against malign influence, malign actors that are really trying to break up the EU. We can see it every day. We can see how powers have Syria is working at it. Iran has teamed with Russia and China to push out destructive messages. And so you have malign actors lining up and trying to break apart a very important ally, the EU. We think that it's really important, and it's going to get harder every day as we see the PRC make inroads with their Belt and Road efforts and things right in Europe.
But should we then expect a change in the approach of the president? Because you say that the PRC and other malign actors are trying to break up organizations like the EU. But I mean, the president has questioned Article 5, or has at least multiple times not been willing to say, well, we will absolutely support Article 5. That undermines NATO. When he began the trade war against China, he threatened and basically initiated a trade war with the EU at the same time, instead of uniting the EU and the United States in the trade war against China. So will that change, that the president is basically attacking his own allies while also attacking the PRC?
So as far as the trade with the EU, we want reciprocal trade. He's talked about having no tariff, no barrier trade, and just let it be free. He wants the lowest barriers and the lowest tariffs possible. And there are a lot of things that Europe does that the US doesn't do that blocks this free trade. There are many, many examples. And he's hoping that Europe will be a good ally and have free trade and not block. And we look at some of the European countries, and they just are really, really activists against reorganizing and having transparent, true free trade. And of course, we need to work with the EU and other allies to get this trade right with China. When we see, I have to say, you know, when I buy certain products, I used to. I don't think I can buy them anymore when I think that they're made by slaves, you know, Uyghur slaves. For me, it's having that knowledge. It makes me reconsider what I purchase. And I know that there are countries, I look at Japan, they're going to pay countries to move their supply chain out of China and put it in other places that don't have this kind of malign influence and threats against trading partners. And I think that it's probably something that other countries will look at as well. I mean, Japan has a huge economy. So that's going to be substantial. But I think to allow things to continue the way they have after this pandemic and after the open threats and sharp, not just rhetoric, but offenses against companies and people. Even no employee of any American company is too small for them to say, fire that person because we don't like what they tweeted or said. I mean, that's where we are today, and I think it's unsustainable.
So if we look at the general international system, as you also presented, and as it presented in multiple strategy documents, it's a great power competition. That's the term used by both the Pentagon and the State Department, and also Secretary of State Mike Pompeo uses it multiple times and says, he said in a speech a couple of months ago, deterrence is back, basically, with regards to the Middle East, and it seems also at times against China. But could you talk a bit about what do you see, what does the US State Department see as the defining feature of this new great power competition? I mean, is it power politics like we saw it in the 19th century and before World War II, or is it multilateral organization, human rights? What's the defining feature? What is the centerpiece of US and also should be European approach to this?
That's a really good question. And so I'll answer personally. I think that the US and the EU and our Western allies must defend our shared democratic values. The fact that we have transparency, the fact that we elect our government, and that if we're unhappy, we have a voice and feedback that we can speak. The fact that we have freedom of religion, assembly, the rule of law, that if we sign a contract, we honor it. We don't retrade and cheat. The fact that we hold each other to a high standard, that we don't steal things from each other. It's all of these things are important to Western value and Western civilization. If we don't defend them vigorously, they're under such stress by the PRC with their power in trading and their Marxist ideals, along with others. I mean, Russia has been oppressing in this way with their, whether it's disinformation or invading European allies or aggressing ships. I mean, just recently, the PRC, I think they caused a Filipino ship to sink, and it was in Filipino waters. The aggression that they're showing toward Hong Kong pro-democracy people, where they're arresting the leadership just this past few days, and Taiwan, where they're saying, well, we may have to, by force take Taiwan. This is the world, the civilized world should say no to this. And there are levers that we have, but the more that we're intertwined and that companies and powerful people have a vested interest in keeping the system there the same, I think it becomes more and more difficult. So I think that the moment is now, and I don't know that there will be another opportunity like this. They are oppressing more and more. Since I've been in Denmark, just in 2.5 years, the shape of the rhetoric and the sharpness, the boldness, the fact that they tried to coerce little Faroe Islands. I mean, there's just no bounds to it. And so I think that we have to seize the moment together. And I hope that the Europeans have the will.
I think now maybe Charlotte, is it time for questions from the attendees, or?
Yes, there's a million questions, so I don't know whether we will have time. But I already actually before this event that I was sent some questions, so I'll start out by one or two of these and then go to the questions of the audience. There's due to the discussion that has been recently around the Greenland. There's a question from Liselotte Olgaard, who's at the Hudson Institute at the moment, on the role of the Arctic Council in the regions. So what do you see, how do you see the role of the Arctic Council in terms of addressing infrastructure, environment, health, education, and security? And do you see that there is a need for the Arctic Council actually also to go into security area so that we have to keep the area as a low tension region?
Well, hello to Liselotte. She's a fantastic person, and I have met her. I had the honor when I visited Hudson Institute, and they do such good work. I think that I think we should keep the Arctic Council the way it is. I think to have an open forum where we can discuss issues with the Russians is really important. I think it is basically the only forum where we really have free dialogue these days. So I hope that that it will stay the way it is, and we will focus on the things that it does best.
Okay, and now questions from the attendees at the moment. So there's a question from Hans-Jan Lund Andersen. He says, "Hi, my name is Hans. Do you or the US think that China should be asked to pay some of the losses that the world economy has suffered because of the COVID-19 virus?"
That's a really great question. I do believe there will be a conversation, and I think I've heard the secretary and the president both mention this, but I think right now we need to get through the caring for our folks, our citizens who are infected, who may be in the hospital, for the families that have lost a loved one recently. And then we should, I know that they've talked about looking at this economic damage also, and how are we made whole?
Questions from Lars Andersen. Faced with global challenges and threats such as the ongoing pandemic and climate change, is the US government view that we need more or less binding international cooperation? And if this is the view of the US, that we should have more cooperation, how does the US see itself taking a leading role in strengthening international cooperation?
Well, of course we need international cooperation, but our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has talked about how we like to see business be the leader in things like the green energy transition. We really think that that capitalism and the free market and the interest of each individual company and company owner is making great progress. In the past, since 2005 until 2018, our economy went up 25% and our carbon emissions went down 10%. So we've decoupled, just through free market, decoupled progress in economic growth with our pollution. And I think we're winning on that when we have a lot of experience in development and manufacturing and doing it in a green way. We often legislate locally, but individual companies and individuals have a passion for this in the United States, and we're very innovative, just like Denmark. So we're coming up with new solutions to these challenges.
So you don't think that we should, the U.S. should not sign up again to the Paris Climate Agreement?
Well,
be part of that.
I hear what you're saying. The Paris Climate Agreement allowed China not only to continue to pollute like it's doing now, but allowed it to increase its pollution until 2030. While the US and Denmark, we had to make a lot of changes, which we would lose employees, like companies would have to close. Our economies would be negatively affected. It's basically the Paris Climate Accord paying money to organizations to go ahead and operate manufacturing and things like that. And it was not a virtuous cycle. It's a sort of an unnatural change. And so we think it's better to do this for the benefit of the climate, but not to allow countries that are the biggest polluters to continue without changing their ways. Everything we were doing would be by far negated by China's increase, and they didn't have to contribute or make any changes. In fact, they're planning to open so many new coal-fired plants in China and around the world in the next few years that all the coal plants coming offline in Europe will be far surpassed by China's increase.
So, but in Denmark and in EU, we feel very strongly about the Paris Climate Agreement, and we see it as a way for cooperation. And we hope, I'm sure we hope that the US will come on board again on this in that, and also in other ways, but I hope so. So here's a question from Jesper Akil. If reciprocity is a goal in US-Danish relations, could you elaborate on the US strategy in Greenland? Contract works on the Thule Air Base have been awarded to US contractors in contradiction with the Danish-US agreement. Will this win-lose approach continue in the future in this region?
Well, I'm happy to say that the employment has stayed the same. There are many, many Danish employees at Thule Air Base, and there are also Greenlandic apprentices. And those have stayed the same no matter who was running the base maintenance contract. It was openly bid, the base maintenance contract, several years ago before I arrived at post. And it was actually held up in court twice that it was a legal contract. However, after the Greenlanders have raised their concerns with me, every time I meet with them, I have gone to the Department of Defense at the Pentagon and raised this with them. They're aware of the concerns and they are in discussion. They are looking at it as a possibility to rebid the contract.
And then here's a question from Søren Vato. The United States recently gave 12 million USD to civil projects in Greenland. So how much coordination did the US have with the Kingdom of Denmark when making this agreement? And how do Mr. Trump see the future relations between Greenland and the US? Thanks, Søren Vato.
Okay, thanks for that question, Søren. The US wants a great relationship with the whole Kingdom of Denmark. I mean, that's our goal. And we would like to see more trade with the entire kingdom. The support package that's been created for Greenland, it came after discussions with the former government in Copenhagen and the current government in Copenhagen, and talking to Greenlanders from all walks of life, business people and Greenlandic government officials, to ask them what's important to them, what would they like to see happen that we can help with, where we have experience. And so the number one things that came up to us was education, tourism, and the mining and oil and gas. And so those are the things that we focused on. But the US has a lot of experience in the high north in Alaska, our Arctic state. And so we hope to share experiences and you know, sort of the successes and the challenges of our Arctic state. There are a lot of similarities. We have indigenous people, much like Greenland has. And so they go and they have celebrations amongst themselves and also with the Canadian indigenous people. There's a wonderful community, and our folks that live in the Arctic share this.
Then there's a question from Lynn Mortensgaard, who's a researcher in the area of the Arctic. In view of last week's events, the aid package to Greenland and also Ambassador Barbin's reply in Politiken, does the ambassador think that the headline of the Arctic as a low-tension region is still fitting? And how specifically does the US plan to maintain the Arctic as a low-tension region?
We do want the Arctic to be a low-tension region. Unfortunately, Russia has renovated and built up to, well, more than 470 points of militarization along their Arctic coast. And so if you look from the direction of Russia, you look at Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. That's in your view. We want low tension, and we want to have good relationships with everyone. There is a concern that Russia is militarizing their Arctic coast. I think the agreement that we've made with the kingdom, with Greenland, it honors the spirit and the letter of our former agreements. And so I disagree, and I think that you can see in our actions that we are very interested in keeping the Arctic a low tension zone.
Then we have a question from Hans-Jørgen Lund Andersen again. Is the USA concerned about the situation in North Korea? So it's a different direction. Nobody seems to know what Kim Jong-un's health situation is.
So I appreciate that question, and I'm also interested in what's going on in North Korea. Unfortunately, since I don't serve in South Korea or in that region, I haven't been following the most detailed information. But I've read different accounts about what's going on in North Korea, and our hope is that things stay stable in North Korea.
Okay, and then I think we have a final question from Jan Top Christensen, who is actually at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. So he asks, South China Sea, we can observe that EU, including Denmark, continues shying away from confronting China when it comes to the continued Chinese militarization of the South China Sea. to what extent will the Trump administration change policy and behaviors towards China in the China-South China Sea?
Well, we insist on free sea lines of communication, and there are ships that sail through that region by the United States and our allies to remind China that they don't own that sea. And in fact, even the islands, the Spratly Islands that they have militarized and turned into kind of like huge battleships in the middle of the ocean, these aren't even their property. And they said to the world, oh, we're just taking them, but we're not going to militarize them. This is, I don't know how many years ago. And the world kind of shrugged, well, you know, it's not really yours. And they denied they would militarize. And the next thing they did was militarize. So you have to watch, they often use a dual civilian and then military component. And that's why we're very aware of, for instance, scientific research by the PRC. They go into a place and they say, oh, it's just scientific. And then suddenly there's some kind of a military fusion. Unfortunately, they are being very aggressive with fishing boats from other countries. They've knocked boats in, you know, they've sunk boats. They've aggressed boats from other from other countries in that region. And we are concerned, and the president has said that this cannot stand, and we make sure, the Department of Defense makes sure that we do have a presence in that region. It's very, very important that this doesn't grow. And that's one of the reasons we look at the high north and we say China has now shown an interest in the Arctic. We wouldn't like to see a South China Sea in the Arctic where they block free lines, the sea lines of communication in that region either, because this is what they do. They don't follow the rules, and they make no one is stopping their nefarious behavior. And so that's why we want to work with the Europeans, with Denmark specifically here, to make sure that every nation is held accountable.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Thank you for taking your time today and presenting your views here in the Foreign Policy Society. I'm sure that we'll continue the discussions in the coming years to come, and there'll be a lot of rethinking about things because of the virus and because of all the other kind of things that's going on in the world today. But thank you so much for giving your thoughts, and thank you to Philip Christian Ulrich for being here also, and thank you to you, audience, for putting in your questions and listening. So have a nice evening to all of you. Bye-bye, and thank you.
Thanks.